everyone, welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name's Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics at Jesus College, where I'm also the Access Fellow. I'm here with two fantastic guests, starting in alphabetical order. Becky, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Becky. I'm a third year medical student here at Jesus College, and I'm originally from the Wirral, which is just outside of Liverpool.
Lovely. And Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah. I'm the Access Officer here at Jesus College.
Excellent. So today we're talking about stress. And as with all of the podcasts, we just ask lots of questions such that a curious young child might ask and try and figure out some answers to them. So, Becky, can you help us out a little bit with some of the medical sciences around stress? In other words, what happens to our bodies when we are in a stressed situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I'm going to start off at the brain. So when we're perceiving a stress, all of this information is collected in the hypothalamus of the brain. That's kind of where all of the sensory information is integrated. And then the hypothalamus does several things. First of all, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is basically the fight or flight response of the body. This is where adrenaline is released, which gets our heart rate going, tightens up blood vessels, things like this. And then it also sends hormones down to the adrenal glands. And then from the adrenal glands, this is where chemicals such as cortisol are released, and cortisol being the main stress hormone. And then these hormones kind of circulate around the body, and they act on pretty much every cell in your body to do different things. So the main things that you would feel when you're stressed are this maybe feeling of panic, this high heart rate, your blood pressure would spike, and this is kind of doing several things. But first of all, diverting blood to kind of where it's necessary, to your muscles if you needed to run or something like this, and also to your brain so you can make these decisions.
Right. And so stress evolved well before human beings, right? This is something that we share with other animals, right?
Yes, yeah, for sure. So it's not just psychological stresses as we might think about in our day-to-day life. It can also be stresses that can impact even a tiny bacteria, which is just one cell.
Right.
So for example, things like extreme heat or cold can even be sensed by these unicellular organisms. And then the type of changes that we'd see in these organisms are maybe different than we'd see in a human. These would be, for example, different changes in gene expression and things like this. So they can upregulate certain proteins that'll help them in these difficult environments. But yeah, these stress responses are seen all the way from these tiny organisms all the way up to us.
Great, that's really helpful. The word stress seems to be a bit of a catch-all. Is that fair? Because lots of states seem quite similar to what you've just described. So if we're very angry, if we're feeling very ashamed or panicked, as you said, they all seem to have quite a similar profile. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I would say that is reasonable. And I'd say it's also interesting to say that stress as a concept was really only brought into the medical sciences under 100 years ago.
Right.
So it was only actually defined as a concept in 1936. And then that initial concept kind of is like a catch-all. So I think in that initial definition of stress, it said something like stress is any physiological activity that could cause a state of panic or a state of anger or things like this. And I think it is fair to say from that kind of catch-all definition that a lot of the emotional states we see can be described as a state of stress. And even a lot of the disorders that we may not think of being disorders of stress, such as things like type 2 diabetes
right.
or cardiovascular disease, all have their roots in stress. So it is a very, very broad definition in the medical sciences, for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Leah, have you heard of Whamageddon?
I think so, but probably only by you. So
Might need to remind listeners. So this is the phenomenon where someone tries to avoid hearing Wham's Last Christmas song during the month of December, except for Christmas Day. So I tried to play this for the first time this last Christmas time and failed pretty quickly because Wham is played all over the place. Now, I felt quite stressed going into public places, knowing that it's quite possible that Wham's Last Christmas could be played. What do you think that tells us about stress in the modern world? Or maybe what does it tell you about me and my problems? But
that's quite difficult. I mean, I guess it's so different to you think about fight or flight responses and been like quite serious things, and Wham doesn't seem quite comparable
Right,
to
it's
that
not life
in
or
the
death,
slightest.
is it?
Yeah, I can't say I've ever tried to avoid Wham, but I think it just shows how many things are out of your control as well. I think is quite an important part of
Right,
that.
but I suppose also just that we seem to learn a lot of stresses, right? That,
Yeah.
that our society sort of perhaps imposes on us things that we ought to be stressed about, whether it's exams or the size of our TVs or the shininess of our kitchens. You know, a lot of it seems so far removed from what Becky was just describing around, you know, fighting or fleeing to survive. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I don't really know what to...
Well, I just in a sense, it feels like we're just getting stressed over stuff it's kind of made up to a significant extent. We're stressing ourselves out over minor things, and I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of this, but do you think that's accurate?
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it could be... It's quite a sweeping generalisation.
Mm.
Like, when you think about something like Wham, it does seem
Yeah.
like irrational per se. But
Yeah.
I think a lot of the things that people stress about that, you know, are kind of externally imposed aren't necessarily the same order. I think there's levels to it.
And I suppose, Becky, that sort of brings to mind this idea that people seem to have varying capacities to deal with stress, and the extent to which they might be born with a different temperament, or to which they have learnt better coping mechanisms. So could you help us sort of figure out the differential between learnt and sort of born?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I think, so if you look at a person, each individual person will have a different response physiologically to the same stressor, even though that response will like be similar on like a plane. People have like more or less extreme responses. For example, if I gave you a stressor, the level of cortisol that your body might emit may be different to someone else, just an example. And I think to a certain degree, that will be in everyone's genetic profile. So like this will be, you know, from birth, everyone will have like these slight differences. But in terms of like how we learn that then across our life, there's kind of two different aspects. First of all, there's the epigenetic aspect. So epigenetic just basically means changes in the ways our genes are expressed. So kind of all the different things you experience throughout your life can change how your genes are expressed. So for example, if you have a very traumatic experience when you're young, this may make you more likely to turn on the gene that produces cortisol, and you'll have higher cortisol to, you know, kind of a minor stressor, for example. But then obviously we have the psychological aspect to how we deal with stress. And I think this can be, just by a totally like whole range of things. This is influenced from what we like see on the telly, from how we see our parents handle stress when we grow up, to the friends that we're around. Like all of these minor things throughout our life can like change the way we handle stress.
Right, yeah, it's really interesting. And so anger is something I really struggle to understand, Leah. So, for example, I can get really irritated by a song being stuck in my head, or an itch on the end of my nose, and I can't quite explain to myself why I'm finding that so triggering. Because again, this is not like my life is depending on it. My body seems to be reacting quite strongly. So, I mean, what do you suppose is going on with anger? One theory I've heard is that anger is closely aligned to fear. It's like a fear response, and that sometimes when people act out in anger and aggression, that they're actually potentially anxious and concerned. But I don't really understand what the anxiety I might have over a song stuck in my head or an itch on the end of my nose. I mean, what sort of things are going through your head right now?
I don't know. I think with those two examples, it just seems like annoyance rather than like how could you, like, it's quite difficult to root that back to fear, I think.
It is, isn't it?
Like,
yeah.
Because I say, like, the angriest I probably get is, like, if you've got, like, slow walkers in front of you. That's, like, annoyance more than, like...
But isn't annoyance just kind of the same family? It's a sort of lower grade...
I guess. Like, I don't know. I kind of see it as something that escalates into anger, like, in context of other things happening. But I don't know. It's like quite a difficult thing to link back to fear. Like, I'm sure you could.
It is, yeah. Well... So one possible way to link it back to fear is you could say that we are quite status obsessed as a species. In other words, we're interested in our position in a pecking order, and we might sort of think that an itch is somehow, you know, getting in the way of us being the way we ought to be, and it's somehow an inconvenience. Or as you say, people walking slowly, they're not of your tribe, or they're in your way, and they're blocking you from reaching your destination, literally and maybe figuratively in your mind. What do you think about that? Do you think that's sort of overstretching the fear narrative?
I guess, like, I don't know, because I think a lot of the time with fear, you're not, like, actively thinking of it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't link back kind of subconsciously to fear.
Right.
Like, I don't know, like, it could even just be, like, past experiences, right? Like, if you're stuck behind someone that's walking slow, like, you could have been stuck behind someone that was walking slow before, and then it's made you late for something, and you'd then fear that, and then it's kind of like a learned behaviour to that, because that definitely has happened, and that would make more sense. But you're not necessarily consciously thinking, oh, I'm, like, fearful because these people are walking slow in front of me. But
sure. I mean, I suppose a clearer example would be something like pronunciation. If someone says scone or scone, it can be quite triggering for some individuals. They can even get actually quite irate about it, right? And so I wonder whether they are just unconsciously thinking, well, this is someone who's not from my in-group. And they're not necessarily reflecting on it like that, but they're cross because they fear them in some sort of unconscious way. I don't know. Do you think we're at risk of overstretching this, Becky? What are your thoughts?
I think it's worth thinking from like a neuroscience point of view as well. So when we look at the brain, there's something called the limbic system, and the limbic system is basically in charge of like how we feel emotions and how these emotions are generated inside of us.
Right.
And what I will say is that fear and anger use a lot of the same parts of the limbic system.
Right.
So this is potentially where we get this like crossover between the two. But I think there is like definitely something to be said for kind of like in groups and out groups. Like when we're looking from an evolutionary perspective, it's evolutionary advantageous to us to have a group of people that we can like work with and work in between. And then when we're seeing something that's kind of like outside of our scope, I think there is like a chance that can cause like fear and anger kind of mix between.
I suppose the risk, and this is a perpetual risk in science, is to say something that's unfalsifiable, which is a horrible bit of jargon, but basically means where you say something that's so vague it could apply to literally every circumstance, and you couldn't possibly disprove its validity. Is that something we should be careful with, Becky?
I think that is something to be careful with, but I also think that when we're looking at it from kind of like a cognitive science point of view, these kind of unfalsifiable statements are used quite a lot.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's kind of like necessarily a bad thing in this context, because there are kind of like broad general themes that can apply to like pretty much every circumstance. But I think the way to go forward to kind of like tease apart this debate would be maybe to like look deeper into like the neurological aspect of it.
Right.
So if we can like kind of track which regions of the brain come up with like fear and anger and things like this, we might be able to make a clearer distinction to if they're both happening at the same time, or if one kind of like triggers the other or something like that. So that might be the way to tease apart kind of like a unfalsifiable statement like this and kind of get to the root of it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, so, Leah, I'm going to lower the tone, so listener discretion is advised. If I was to fart loudly on a train, I would be horrified, and I would get many of the stress responses that Becky described. You know, my heart rate would go up, I'd feel all butterflies in my stomach and feel just absolutely horrified, and it would take a good half day to recover from the embarrassment of that. Shame I find really interesting as to why we would feel ashamed about something which is totally natural, unavoidable. I'm afraid we all fart regularly, don't we? Why do you think it leads to such a strong reaction?
I guess, like, because of, like, that's kind of what you're told as well. Like, that's, like, society does not accept that. So,
no,
like,
right.
It's kind of how you're just conditioned to be. But then, like, from another aspect, it's like, if you did just, like, start shouting in the middle of the train, like, I feel like some people do that shamelessly, but, like, you're drawing a lot of attention to self in a public place that's quiet. Like, it is, like, that kind of side of it makes sense as well.
So one word that's sometimes associated with that level of embarrassment is mortified, which I think is really interesting and revealing, because that comes from a sort of French Latin root meaning to feel like you're dead. And one theory about shame is that you are kind of playing dead. So of the fight, flight, freeze response, you're in the freeze response, you're shutting down and you're frozen in anxiety. With the possible theory being that that's to try and protect you from a very severe external stimulus, a very severe threat, is that you're just closing down and playing dead. What do you think, Becky? Do we play dead when we fart in public?
Yeah, I would say so, to be honest. I think this is kind of like what you're describing as like an isolated incident here could also be is what we describe as the basis of things like social anxiety and things like this. I think there's a lot of crossover there, as in people just tend to like shut down. They don't want to look up because if they look up, they'll see people like looking at them. All of these things, trying to make yourself like as small as possible so that you're not perceived. And I think that's just because people don't want to be seen as like an anomaly. Like in the situation where you're like farting on a train, you've used so much attention on yourself that you just don't want to have all of like those eyes on you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So I suppose in terms of relieving stress now, so Becky, you mentioned how the sympathetic nervous system is involved in us feeling stress. How do we wind down? How does the opposite happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So from like a biological perspective, with all of these systems, so I said like the hypothalamus will release things that signals to the adrenal gland, but also we have something called negative feedback in that system. So that basically means when the adrenal gland does release cortisol, this will go up and act back on the hypothalamus and prevent the release of things that started it originally to kind of like calm you down in the situation. And then obviously if the like threat stimulus can sit like carries on, then more signals will go to the hypothalamus, you'll get more release. But we do have this negative feedback system to kind of like calm everything down. And then as opposite to the sympathetic nervous system, we also have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we like to colloquially call rest and digest. So these kind of use like the opposite hormones when you're going into a more restful state to kind of like relieve that anxiety, slow your heart rate down, decrease your blood pressure, so widen your blood vessels to do that, or things like that.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. So, Leah, what helps you calm down? Does it help you if someone tells you to calm down, for example?
No, I feel like that makes you more like irrationally angry, right? Because you're like, because I feel like it's not always that simple. Like, you're like, that doesn't necessarily translate into an actual response to it. So, I don't know. Usually, like fresh air, green space. Like a change in environment. If it's kind of like an environment that's causing you stress, then literally being in a different place can be quite helpful to that. But I guess it depends on how stressed you are as well. Like sometimes a little bit of green space isn't going to fix it. So
and those prescriptions are as old as time, aren't they? But is there any science behind it, Becky? Do you think that people have been saying go out and get some fresh air, take some deep breaths? Is there something to that?
Yeah, I think that actually really is, to be honest. I think the science backs this up too. For example, like people often say like move your body, if you're feeling stressed, like get that exercise in. And we've actually seen in a recent meta-analysis, which basically just means an analysis of lots and lots and lots and lots of scientific papers looking at stress and like low mood and things, that exercise and being outside and moving your body is even more effective than say things like anti-anxiety meds and things like this. So I think it really is rooted in something, even if we don't quite know the like mechanistic action behind it.
Oh, that's interesting. Is that because you're kind of using the cortisol for something concretely rather than just letting it flow around your body, or is that?
I'm not sure if that's the exact reason, but to be honest, I'm not sure what we would use cortisol for other than that.
Okay.
But I think it kind of like helps when you're exercising anyway, you already have that high heart rate and things like this, so it doesn't feel quite as out of place. And then when you're like cooling down from exercise, or like you've stopped your walk or whatever, your heart rate will naturally decrease, and this helps to have like and like an anti-anxiety effect. But in this circumstance, I'm not sure if the cortisol is kind of like being used up in a different way. Okay. I think it's other things that are maybe at playing.
Interesting. And how far do you feel, Leah, that we can control our stress? Do you think that we have, it is to a degree a matter of choice how stressed we become in our daily lives, or do you think it's beyond our control?
I guess, like, as we've spoken about, obviously to an extent, it's like a pre-given on how stressed you can get or be, or like respond to different things. But I don't know, I guess I don't see it as like a natural state to be stressed. Like, there is obviously lots of different things that exist to like mitigate against stress and alleviate it. So I think, and I don't necessarily think it's a choice though. Like, just because there's things to, in like contrast to it, doesn't mean that being stressed is a choice. Like, you don't necessarily have the choice not to be stressed, but I'd say there is ways to limit it.
Well, the assumption it is a choice is kind of the basis of a statement like, oh, just calm down, or
Yeah.
get a grip. You know, you could just make a better choice here and you feel fine. It does seem a little bit odd. I mean, but Becky, you described the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which connected with this, the autonomic system, which sort of gives the implication that we don't have much control over it. It's subconsciously. We can't just actually... I can't think my heart rate down, for example. Is that right? Or is there anything that, I mean, as humans, perhaps compared to other animals, we have a bit more control?
I think that is right. As a general sense, we don't have much control over our autonomic nervous system, kind of does things by itself. But also I will say, when we're thinking of like our sensory inputs, which are kind of collated all together, which kind of cause these stress responses, I think we do have quite a large influence on things like this. For example, if people have, if we're looking at it from like a pathological point of view, when kind of stress goes wrong, we're looking with people with very severe anxiety or things like this, they often undergo cognitive behavioural therapy. And this CBT is basically trying to change their thought patterns so that they can have more influence over their body. And it has been shown to be highly effective. So I would say that we can like kind of build up coping mechanisms, but to a certain degree, they are like happening without our conscious thought.
Right, and I suppose if we are reacting to an external stimulus with a fight or flight response, then that could again link back to elements of fear. And I suppose one of the primal fears is that we will be malnourished or rejected by our group. So dealing with some of the fundamental basics would seem like quite a good idea, right? In other words, just making sure you're well fed and you're well watered, so your body doesn't feel like it's starving before going into that stressful situation. Is that right? Or is that naive? I don't know.
No, I think that's completely right. I think the food thing is super interesting. So talking about the hypothalamus, which is kind of where this all starts in the brain, that's also the site where all of your like hunger and your like, when you're feeling full, feelings all kind of coordinate together as well.
Right.
And it's actually been shown that when you are full, kind of all the hormones that are released when you're like digesting your food and everything actually make it very hard for you to be stressed, which is interesting. But it's also difficult because it kind of works two ways, as in when people get stressed, some people get more hungry, but then a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to touch food, like I don't have an appetite at all, because they kind of like interplay with each other. But I would say, yeah, dealing with the basics is a very, very good way to start.
Well, if you're very stressed, you can feel quite sick, can't you?
Yes,
and so
you can.
Eating can be quite difficult at that stage.
Yeah, for sure. There's a nerve that runs like from this portion of the brain right to the stomach, which is kind of where the signals get passed back and forwards, which is like an interesting area of research at the moment when we're looking about stress and things. But yeah, it can be difficult, but I do think, doing the basics of like eating, drinking, all of this can help you, especially in the long run, to not feel as stressed.
Right, and sleep? Do you get enough sleep, Leah?
Seems a bit personal.
I've asked you some very personal questions, but yeah.
I'd say so.
Yeah. It just seems to be one of those things where you're recharging your batteries and you're avoiding just depletion of your resources, right? It seems to be quite sensible. So, Leah, what about Oxford? Is Oxford a stressful place? It's quite a common question we're actually asked by prospective applicants.
Yes. I think like university in general is. So because you're like so many parts of your life are changing at once simultaneously, and obviously that is workload, but like as we've discussed throughout, I don't necessarily think that stress is you don't necessarily, there is ways to kind of like deal with it, but yeah, like in short it is stressful, but that's also okay.
So I'm just going to double down on the personal question. So you presumably knew it was going to be quite stressful before you applied. So you put yourself into that environment. Do you think you can explain why you might have chosen to do that?
I guess it's kind of like a balance, right, between like reward and then stress. But I think as well, like you don't necessarily know how you're going to experience something because it is so personal until you've like gone through it or like are in the midst of it. So like even if you'd heard like really bad horror stories about coming to Oxford, or the complete opposite to that, people saying, oh, you're not going to be stressed at all, then you don't know how you're going to respond to it, because like every course is different, everyone's personal experience is different, like, and I feel like a lot of the time the stress comes from like more than one factor. It's not just the work, for example, like it would come from multiple things.
Right, and Becky, so medicine's quite an intense programme at any university, but at Oxford you're kind of potentially, although I'm keen to know your thoughts, adding to that. So what would you say to someone who asks you if medicine at Oxford is stressful?
Yeah, I will say that from my own personal experience, I kind of don't find the day-to-day life that stressful.
Okay,
because like the actual working week, you know, you've got a mix of like you're doing a lab here, you're doing a lecture here, you know, you're doing some cadaver work here, and it's all very mixed. So I actually find that very exciting. I will say I do find the exam periods very stressful, but I think that's why it's so important, if anyone was thinking about doing medicine, for example, is to kind of like build in your coping strategies for this stress like very early. So if when it comes to like an exam time, or maybe just a time you're finding things a bit more difficult, you have things that you can fall back on that you know will like make you feel a bit better in the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, speaking as an examiner, I know, and someone who also used to find exams very stressful, I suppose the way academics see it is not that this exam is the one chance for you to prove your entire life, right? I think students can be inclined to catastrophize a little bit, that this one exam, if it goes even slightly wrong, the rest of their life will be an absolute disaster, but that's rarely the case, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And from talking to professors who are examiners and things like this, they're so passionate about their subject that all they really want to see is someone who like has that passion, who like has like engaged with the content and has maybe like some new thoughts and ideas to write down, which will be interesting to them. I will say with medicine, there are like a certain set of things that you just have to know, which can be like the stressful part. But once you can like have some techniques to learn those things, you do have a bit more creative freedom.
Nice. Leah, what does the university do to try and help its students manage stress, if anything?
I mean, I guess there's quite a lot, and it's probably in a sense one of the like benefits of Oxford because of the like collegiate system, and there's so many like levels of support. Like even your own personal tutor is kind of like you're constantly checking in with someone to kind of recognise that. But then obviously there's the whole like welfare systems that exist and things like that, but also like some more student-led things which are really cool and helpful. So like my college, we had like welfare tea and things like that, which were just an excuse to have a study break and get cake. So, but like there's lots of different things that are built in, I think.
Yeah, some of the colleges have petting zoos and things like that around exam time, which can be quite nice. And I suppose some of the key sources of stress we are conscious of, such as money worries, and so the colleges will have people on hand to particularly address those potentially, or academic worries, and as you said, mental health is there's good facilities for that as well. Great. Well, thank you both very much. I'm feeling much calmer now. I might go and have a walk nonetheless to just reinforce this new feeling of zen. But I really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the What, Why, When podcast. Thanks so much. Bye.